Realm presents Born to the Blade, Episode 9.
Prologue. The open space around the lift station on the lowest level of Twaa-Fei was always crowded. There were the people waiting for the lift for transport to the middle or upper islands. Thrice a 10-day, there were formal markets that took place in the plaza, and there were always at least a few vendors taking advantage of the traffic. This crowd, however, was an entirely different beast. Standing in the center of the plaza, Yokno, Seneschal of Twaa-Fei, observed the situation. Barricades of scavenged materials, tables, small boats, even a few monarch bones, blocked off two of the smaller avenues out of the plaza. Twaa-Fei security forces were arm-linked at the mouth of another, a roaring, chanting crowd behind them. A messenger ran up and handed Yokno a folded note. He read it and turned to the captain standing beside him. "Send more troops to Bard's Neck and coordinate with the Dockers Union. I'll be back in 3 hours." The captain saluted as Yokno, drawing his robes around him, withdrew to the single lift still authorized for travel to and from the lowest island. The air grew noticeably sweeter and cleaner as he rose. Despite himself, because Yokno tried not to play favorites among the citizens of Twaa-Fei, even when some were busy destroying things, he found his shoulders relaxing and his breath coming easier when he stepped off the lift to the pleasing and strife-free boulevards of the upper island. He walked briskly to the council building, entered, and navigated the corridors to the circular chambers. The warders, unused to being kept waiting, turned to him immediately when he entered, wearing expressions of varying degrees of irritation or eagerness. Without letting his eyes stop on her in his survey of the room, Yokno noted that Bologna was seated in Lavinia's place. At this rate, none of the older warders would be left. Clearing his throat, Yokno stepped to the podium. "I have come directly from the lowest island to inform you of the situation there." He let a modicum of exhaustion into his voice. He had been with the security forces all night. "The unrest has spread. While the initial disturbance came from a small group of Rumican refugees unhappy with the assistance they'd received, the riots have now become a catch-all for any number of discontents. Twaa-Fei residents have been fighting in the streets. We have confirmed reports of..." He glanced at his notes. "Kuloi and Rumican citizens scuffling. There have also been attacks on the Zenitai community. We've identified Kakute and Vanian gangs, and there may be others." He glared out at the warders. They had all been looking at Chris, but almost all of them were implicated. "Warders, I ask you to each fulfill your role and calm your populace." After a moment of heavy silence, Yokno continued. "However, please use caution. Some of these groups predate the current unrest and may be armed. In addition, the dock workers have been agitating for higher wages. It is not a full-on strike yet, but it may reach that point by the end of the day. If so, I need not remind you not only goods transfer, but communications will be heavily impacted. We have only minimal food stocks on the Triple Islands. It is imperative that we keep the docks open." Yokno removed himself from the podium in a flurry of robes and seated himself in the chair allocated to him against the wall of the room. There was silence, and he found himself hoping that he had impressed the seriousness of the situation on the warders, so many of them callow and young. Kristen rose. They looked as though they hadn't slept, hair sticky and lank and eyes bloodshot. "Fellow warders," they began, "we have many issues to discuss. I had hoped to come before you today to ask for your assistance with the refugees who have been driven to Twaa-Fei by violence beyond their control and who are in need of sustenance and shelter, and, as the Seneschal has told us, that question has become only more urgent over the last day." Yokno saw Bologna's lips moving and imagined she was muttering something to herself about the impudence of refugees who burned down their own shelter to ask for more. If it had been Lavinia, he would have been sure. But then Lavinia wouldn't have let her lips move. "However," Chris said, and their voice became more strident, "a yet more egregious atrocity has occurred, in complete disregard for the system of balance and justice that has been constructed here in Twaa-Fei." Chris's rhetoric had certainly improved since they'd become warder, Yokno noted, approving. Then he saw Chris's fingers shuffle. Note cards. Yokno sighed. This was a diminished era of diplomacy. Some of you may not yet know that yesterday morning, a Kulo dreadnought, in defiance of all international norms, removed an entire island from Rumika's skies. Yokno's eyes flicked up in surprise. An island? He glanced at Ojo. The Kuloi warder's eyes were fixed on his lap, his face still and drawn. Yokno felt a stab of sympathy for his old friend. Perhaps he really did have little agency in what was occurring, because surely he would never have authorized something so shocking and, at the same time, so desperately foolish. We demand that the island be returned. We condemn this action, indicative of the worst type of colonialism and violence. And I ask you all to stand with me. Chris's voice was rousing, their face glowing with passion as they stood, their arm outstretched and waiting. There was no response. Michiko seemed frozen to her seat. Bologna had a slight contemptuous smile. Yokno's sharp glance caught Takeshi shifting uneasily. Cassia looked surprised, but she didn't move. Taro appeared perfectly comfortable, as though listening to a toast at a dinner party. The silence stretched and hardened. I demand some action at this point. Losing their composure, Chris ran a hand through their hair, shifted their weight to the other foot in a way that was almost like stomping the floor. It could be one of your islands next. Bologna's scornful smile deepened. Yokno wondered if Chris would call a duel. Their hand was on the hilt of their blade, knuckles white. When they had arrived, that certainly would have been their play, and Lavinia was not here. But Chris was going to have many further disputes with the council in the near future. Perhaps they had realized that calling duels at every council meeting was not the most politically effective course. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Chris finally sat down. Taro let the silence draw out even longer before rising himself and announcing mildly, "If there is no other business, we shall adjourn." A moment. Bologna stood. Taro seated himself again, glaring at her. "As you have all no doubt noticed," Bologna began, "Warder Junius has temporarily been recalled to Murtika. We are standing in the defense of our neighbor Rumika, unfairly attacked and under threat of unjust war." Chris's head shot up, fury written on their features. She let them twist without allies, waiting until they had been completely humiliated to announce that Murtika was supporting them. Yokno allowed himself a tiny shake of his head, but he couldn't help feeling a twinge of admiration as well. Ojo had also looked up, but more slowly. He was not surprised, Yokno thought, reading his steely expression. He was ready. "As such, Murtika declares war on Kalo. We invite our allies to join us." Bologna stopped and let her gaze rest on Ojo, waiting for a challenge. Yokno could not hear a single breath drawn in the room. Ojo against Lavinia would have been difficult, but Ojo could probably beat Bologna. The question was, what good would it do him? Unlike policy, a declaration of war could not be countermanded by a duel. "Thank you," Bologna said finally, her smile still in place. Taro cleared his throat. "Meeting adjourned." Chapter 1. Michiko. Michiko stepped out of the council building and into the warm sunlight of the upper island. She had a sudden memory of boarding the Silver Sparrow, the ship that had brought her to Twaa-Fei. At the time, a council meeting on subjects of importance seemed the height of accomplishment, and the idea of a declaration of war, a war she was being pressured to participate in, would have shocked her to the core. Now, what she felt instead was galvanized. It had finally happened. Everything Murtika had been doing had led up to this, and now it was out in the open. Now she could act. "It's finally happening." A voice beside her echoed her thoughts. Michiko looked up and saw Takeshi. He had the same amiable, slightly weary appearance as always, but Michiko was no longer fooled by his shyness. Takeshi could be one of her strongest allies. Certainly his situation was closest to hers. "That doesn't mean he'll stand up to Murtika," Michiko reminded herself. After all, she wouldn't have when she had first arrived. Without saying another word, they walked together away from the council building. When they had reached a small park where any eavesdroppers would be visible, Michiko paused. "What are you thinking?" she asked in a low voice. Takeshi raised a hand, then drew his blade. For a terrified second, Michiko thought he was going to accuse her of treason and strike her down. But instead, he cut the sigil of shrouded voices around them. Smart. No one could approach without being seen, true, but a blade crafter could augment their distance hearing. Maybe Takeshi had more experience with conspiracy than she thought. It is not exactly a surprise, Takeshi said. Did you receive a conscription order too? Michiko asked. Takeshi's eyes widened. No, you did? They probably don't think Ikarans are worth drafting, he added bitterly. More likely it is a test of my loyalty. Michiko wanted to pace, but in case anyone was watching, she didn't want to draw attention. What will you do? I don't know yet, Michiko said, but she had to do something besides going back to Kensuke's, her, office and staring at the order. What about you? I'm sure we will be drawn in soon enough, Takeshi said. In the more immediate term, I thought I would go down to the lower island. Michiko stared at him. To do what? You heard Yokno. Try to help where I can. I have a number of Zenitai friends. Takeshi paused. Perhaps they can help us, too. In any case, maintaining peace on Twaa-Fei is critical. Intriguing. I was down there last night. Michiko rubbed her forehead. It was messy. The plaza in front of the lifts had been so packed with furious people that she had thought she and Chris might have to climb the lift shaft using spider's grip. A daunting prospect. But they had finally managed to talk their way on using their warder badges. But it should be calmer today. And she never had spoken to the witnesses about the theft of the island. Let's go. Chapter 2. Ojo. They declared war? Adechike was disbelieving, and Ojo was too tired to give him the patience he deserved. Of course they declared war, he snapped. Why had he never realized before just how naive Adechike was? This is what they have been building up to for months. This is the purpose of everything they have done. He paused. With the exception of a little extraneous humiliation on the side, I suppose. He wondered if Bologna's cruelty stemmed from prejudice against Rumikans, personal animus against Chris, or just a general hatred of all non-Merticans. Or maybe after her time with Lavinia, being cruel was all she knew how to do. But don't they understand what this means? Adechike was as distraught as if he himself were about to be called up to fight. It will be incredibly destructive, costing thousands of lives, not to mention the disruption to trade, the destruction of homelands. You do realize we are already at war, do you not? Adechike shook his head. I don't entirely agree with what we're doing in Rumika, but it's an incursion, a small-scale conflict with clearly defined goals based on a real threat. This, Mertika joining means that Kakute and Ikaro will be forced into the war as well. Old resentments will be reborn, and to what end? In their best case... He stopped, face-stricken. That's right, Ojo said. If they win, Kulo will become just another colony of the Mertikan Empire. And they could win, Uncle. Adechike yelled this as though Ojo didn't already know. If Ojo were a betting man and a traitor, his money would be on Mertika in this fight. It's all the High Sky's fault. They are nothing more than warmongers. And now this ridiculous stunt with the Rumikan Island. For what? Enough airstone for one ship, perhaps? Ojo had never seen Adechike so worked up. Even that small quantity of airstone will help keep us afloat, he pointed out. Adechike scoffed. We are so desperate that we need to steal islands to mine now? Yes, Adechike, that is exactly how desperate we are. Ojo grabbed the younger man's shoulders. If we don't get airstone, we will sink beneath the mists. Not in 50 years, not in 30 years, but in 10 or 15. And not only that, but we will be completely incapable of defending ourselves while it is happening. Pretty soon Mertika won't even need to fight us. Adechike stared at him in disbelief. Surely it's not so surely, Ojo stated deliberately. It is. Come now, Uncle, Adechike said. I understand you're upset, but exaggerating doesn't help anything. I am not exaggerating, Ojo tried to order his breathing and his tone so that Adechike would believe him.
The situation is far worse than most people know. We are in dire risk of losing the entire island.
Adechike kept shaking his head, as if that way he could convince Ojo it wasn't true.
That's not possible. I have never even heard of an island disappearing into the mists. Besides, my father would know about it. Your father does know,
Ojo said as gently as he could.
And he didn't.
Adechike's voice trailed off because there was really nothing surprising about his father keeping something from him.
And you,
Adechike's eyes refocused on Ojo.
You didn't tell me either. It wasn't precisely my secret.
But whether to tell his apprentice was his decision. Ojo tried again.
You didn't need to know, and I gain no pleasure from sharing such horrifying news.
His silence was harder to explain than he had thought.
You didn't need to know. You never took me seriously as a warder at all, did you? All I meant was that it seemed still far in the future, but now you need to understand why the High Skies faction is doing what they are doing in Rumika.
Adechike shook him off.
It doesn't matter. Nothing justifies what we are doing. Nothing.
He glared at Ojo.
I know you know that. We are fighting for our survival.
Ojo spoke calmly, but his pulse was pounding in his ears.
That does not justify this,
Adechike growled.
Nothing does.
He turned and slammed out of the room. Chapter 3. Michiko. The situation at the lifts was far less chaotic than it had been yesterday, but possibly more disquieting. The emergency situation had become official. When Michiko and Takeshi explained their errand, they were guided to an area cordoned off with silk twists to wait for the lift that had been commandeered for the exclusive use of city officials managing the crisis. How long does Yokno expect this to last? Michiko wondered, looking at the neatly lettered signs on the other lifts, indicating that they were locked from descending to the lowest island. When they disembarked on the lowest level, it felt similar, more organized, but also worse. There were barricades, actual barricades closing off some streets, and the rioters had set up puppets along the tops of them to flutter and bob mockingly at all the newly arrived. A small platform and draperies had been used to set up a command post in the middle of the plaza, and there was a woman with the 3 hollyhock blooms of a colonel standing beside it, conversing with an aide. "You can take Bisca Street," she said when Michiko approached her for information. "It's been cleared as far as Dongren Boulevard." Michiko hovered, unwilling to admit she didn't know any of the street names on this island. "That one." The colonel pointed it out, then gave Michiko and Takeshi a quick, assessing look, lingering over their blades. "Be careful," she said. "While the worst of the rioting has quieted, some of the more organized street gangs have taken advantage." She nodded at the barricades. "It's mainly an attempt to win some concessions from the government and take tolls from locals, but I don't think they'd be above ransom if it fell into their hands. And they've been careful to paint the upper islands as the enemy."
"What kinds of gangs?"
Takeshi asked. "The Iron Pigeons are a local group, but we've had some trouble from the Zanatan Stonefish Gang as well, and the Appolitoi." She frowned. "And I recommend you stay away from the dock workers." The colonel nodded to them and then turned back to her aide. No attempt to dissuade them. Then again, they were warders. They were supposed to be able to take care of themselves. A cold wash of fear roiled Michiko's innards. There were a few Twaa-Fei soldiers standing around on the first block of Bisker Street, out of the lift plaza, but after that, the island was eerily quiet. They saw no one, and nothing moved, but a lone cat skittering under a garden gate as they passed. Michiko sniffed the air. It smelled ashy, but she couldn't tell if something was still burning or if it was residue from the night before. "This is strange," she whispered. Takeshi was frowning.
"It is dangerous."
Michiko brought her hand to her hilt, but gave him a questioning look. She didn't sense any immediate threat.
"I mean dangerous for the idea of Twaa-Fei. This place is predicated on the idea of neutrality and safety for everyone."
Takeshi glanced at the scorch marks on the white plaster walls of one of the houses lining the avenue. But it seems not everyone felt equally safe. Michiko had never thought of Twaa-Fei in that way. She had seen the conflict in terms of national battles or personal drama. But the idea of losing the fundamental locus of diplomacy filled her with dread. They came to a large cross street. Dangren Boulevard? Michiko hazarded, looking down at both ways. No one was visible. I'm going to try to find the ship that witnessed the island theft. She managed a grin. I guess I'll just avoid the dock workers. Are you still going to see your Xanaten friends? Takeshi was pensive. I am interested to hear what they know about what's going on here. Although I must admit, hearing of a Xanaten gang makes me wonder if it might not be the best time to visit them. I noticed she didn't mention a Murtikan gang, Michiko said lightly. Do you think... Takeshi grabbed her arm, but Michiko had already stopped talking. She heard it too. Shouts and clatter from behind them. She spun around, and a moment later, a dozen women, suited in Vanian blue gowns and carrying poles, spears, and at least one sword, burst out of an alley a block down Bisker. I guess we found the Appolito instead. Takeshi's tone was mild, but his hand tightened on her arm. They seem a little less controlled in this environment than in Phaedra's club. They're coming this way, Michiko said, and realized she was nervously inching her sword up and down in its scabbard. Stay calm, said Takeshi, which didn't help. Hey, one of the women roared. A man! And a Karen! More and more women were pouring into the street. Not all of them were Vanian, but they all seemed to have bought into the movement, wearing similarly styled gowns, although clearly not everybody could afford true Vanian blue. They were turning toward Takeshi with fury in their eyes. Are you going to do something? Michiko muttered to Takeshi. But Takeshi didn't get a chance to complete his answer. What are you doing here? The yell was loud enough to cut through the ambient growl of the crowd, and Michiko looked up. The front line of the mob was only a few dozen steps from them now, and with a shock, Michiko recognized the woman in the front. Dion Galanis. Michiko's first thought was, I beat her once, I can do it again. But this wouldn't be a fight in a ring. Maybe not a fight at all. Galanis was backed by tens, maybe more than 100 believers. You are here to support the Rumikan invasion, aren't you? Galanis yelled, racing ahead of the mob toward them. I knew not to trust you. Her mouth broke into a grin as she drew a short sword. Michiko thought about the ways she could cut Galanis down, by miring her in mud, or turning her fist to ice, or shouting at her with the breath of a tempest. But that would mean getting enmeshed in this mob, and besides, Michiko found herself loath to use craft against someone she had dueled blades with fairly. She carved Gale Step, turning to Takeshi as she did. Are you with me? They're using bladecraft, yelled one of the women behind Galanis. Quick, grab them before they bring down lightning on us all. Michiko hesitated, not wanting to leave Takeshi to the mercy of the mob, but his sword came out in a breath. He started to cut a sigil, and before he had finished 3 strokes, she recognized it as Split the Sky. With the power of Gale Step bolstering her, she was on a roof and heading east before the sigil flashed. Chapter 4. Takeshi. Split the Sky was Takeshi's favorite tactic, and he had refined it precisely to create different effects based on his needs. In this case, he was careful not to scorch anyone. The lightning shocked the mob. Most of them dove for cover, and the rest dropped what they were doing to look up or run in the other direction. Takeshi took off down Dangren Boulevard. When he glanced back, a few of the women were pursuing him, but he had also practiced carving Gale Step while running, and he outpaced them quickly. It took him some time to get his bearings enough to find his way around to the Xanaten neighborhood. He ended up going all the way down to the docks, where workers were muttering uneasily in clusters, and then working his way back up to Little Xenatai, near the northern coast. Naturally, no one was visible. Takeshi walked up and down the street twice, wondering what to do. Usually there were people sitting on the giant wooden benches along the street or standing on the corners. He didn't know exactly where Lanata, one of his embassy servants, lived, and pounding on the door of people's homes seemed rude. Takeshi turned the corner, remembering the small restaurant where he had eaten with Lanata once.
The door was closed, but there he didn't mind knocking, and after a few pounds, it creaked open to reveal a slice of a balding man's anxious face. "I'm looking for Lanata," Takeshi said diffidently, slipping easily into his harmless and timid persona. "Or maybe Miho, or Yuki?" The door opened wider. "Miho's off with the refugees. Lanata might be around." "I can wait," Takeshi said. 10 minutes later, he and Lanata were seated in the restaurant, sharing a pot of mediocre tea. "I just wanted to see if there's anything I can do," Takeshi said, "and also learn what you're seeing of the situation." "Thank you," Lanata said. "It's bad down here. There have been 2 attacks already, and most people are hunkered down in their homes. Maybe if you can bring it to the attention of the seneschal?" "He's how I heard about it," Takeshi answered. "Are the security forces not helping?" "They are more concerned about the docks," Lanata answered. "I don't think they believe we are in real danger, but we are. And the refugees are too." "Why did the refugees burn their shelter?" "They didn't!" Lanata was indignant. "It was a gang of Apalaitoi who wanted to get rid of the refugees. Of course they bungled the arson, but somehow it turned out even better for them because everyone blamed the refugees for it. That story I can try to spread around, because nobody has heard that. We keep trying to talk to the government, but of course we don't have a representative on the council, so..." Lanata shrugged. "I'll see what I can do," Takeshi promised. "They ignore us, but these islands won't work without us. The warders, the rich merchants, all the fancy people in the upper islands need us. They'll see over the next few days." Lanata leaned forward. "That power? We can use it to harm, but we could also use it to help someone. Help them gain power in this city, if they helped us." Takeshi wasn't ready to respond to that, so he changed the subject. "And these attacks?" "They destroyed shops. Stock tried to burn a house down. They want us to leave, but where should we go this time? Where can we go?" "Have there been many injuries?" Takeshi asked, mainly to avoid questions he had no answer to. "Do you need more help at the clinic?" "We can handle that type of healing," Lanata answered with a wan smile. "We're Zenaten." "What do you mean?" Takeshi asked louder than he'd intended. "Oh, it's something of a joke." Lanata eyed him. "Healing was the Zenatai birthright. Of course we lost it, along with our island and our homes in Kuloi aggression, but people like to believe we still have the knack." "I didn't know that was the birthright," Takeshi answered numbly. All his studies said maybe he had been asking the wrong questions. "Most people don't bother to know anything about Zenatai. As far as they're concerned, we no longer exist." Chapter 5. Michiko. Michiko charged along the rooftops, adding agility and speed sigils, and in one case levitation, as needed, to get herself to the docks without setting foot on the ground. When she reached the vast rows of warehouses that faced the seaport, she floated herself down off a low-hanging roof eave and looked around. At least the docks weren't as forebodingly empty as the streets. She saw guards in front of the nearest wharf, and in front of them, knots of men standing around as though waiting for something. Had the work stopped already? Michiko approached the nearest group. "Excuse me, could you direct me to the Green Parrot?" The 4 men turned to look at her. "Yeah, looking for passage off this island?" asked one. "No, I just have a few questions for the captain," Michiko answered. She was feeling less and less certain that this was a good idea. "Hey, Jameer, isn't that the ship docked over in 18B? "It's the ship that saw that island get pulled away," put in a third man, looking Michiko up and down. She ignored him. 18B is that way? Michiko tapped her foot surreptitiously to see how much gale step was left in her. "That way." Michiko started walking. "You won't get in, though," the man called after her. "They blocked everything off. Better get off this island before it's too late," his friend yelled. She kept going, wondering how Takeshi was faring with the mob. Hopefully he'd gotten away quickly. The split-the-sky trick was not a bad... Michiko jumped backward and had her blade out again before she knew what had triggered her. "Whoa there, I'm not trying anything. Just saw you passing and wanted to say hello." Michiko sheathed her blade. Sorry, Antona, I guess this atmosphere is making me a little jumpy.
It should be, the head Oki answered. The dock workers are striking, and any minute now the ship owners union is going to be down here with scabs, and it's going to look like a misfeed in the maelstrom.
Really?
Not a problem. Anton laughed. Come on, we'll wait it out in here. He caught Michiko's arm and ushered her through a dark, overhung door. The room was tiny and dim, lit only by 2 minuscule windows and a whale oil lamp. 5 stools and a couple of packing crates were the sum of its furnishings.
What is this place? Michiko asked. Your pied-à-terre in Twaa-Fei?
Anton laughed again. No, warder, it's a tavern. He went to the back of the room and banged on the wall, and a moment later a disgruntled-looking woman with a runny nose appeared, holding a pint glass in one hand. Seeing Michiko, she ducked back through the door and returned with another one. She set both glasses down on one of the packing crates, touched her forehead in Anton's direction, and backed out again.
We can talk here, Anton said, pulling out a stool and straddling it.
As a matter of fact, I was very happy to chance a meeting with you, Warder Oda.
Why is that?
Michiko asked. She remained standing.
I heard you are looking into the attack on the Rumican fleet. Who told you that? Michiko asked. She had tried to be discreet.
Anton ran a fingertip along the curve of his eyebrow in the sign for conspiracy.
I have my sources, he said. Golden sources, some of them.
Michiko stared. He could not mean... Anton grinned at her.
We Hiroki have our ways of talking to ghosts, he said, kin or not. In any case, my sources tell me you are interested in finding the truth about the fleet, wherever it may lead.
I am, Michiko said. Outside, someone yelled, and a moment later she heard a thump and more raised voices.
Good, Anton said, because there was a survivor. She's been living on the Blue Fang since it happened, and I need someone to figure out what to do with her.
Chapter 6. Bologna. Bologna used to suspect that Lavinia passed most of the drudgery of wardenship onto her. She had labored over endless reports, adjusting her penmanship in rewrite after rewrite, calculated the trade impacts of various decisions on the Mertican Empire, prepared invitations, and chosen gifts for visitors. Now that she was warder, temporary, powerless warder, she knew that she'd only seen a fraction of it. Lavinia had kept the final version of most decisions to herself and never even consulted Bologna about the most sensitive issues. How often did she need to change the code word for communications by ship? What merchant should be selected for refurnishing the second salon and thereby also act as an information source on Twaa-Fei port politics? In the aftermath of the council meeting, Bologna now had to not only write the standard summary report she always used to do, but also the top-secret analysis that Lavinia had never even told her existed before it was demanded of her. At least that meant she could frame it to her own advantage. Surely Lavinia used to do the same. When she'd finished portraying herself as the decisive savior of Twaa-Fei's squabbling underclasses and statesman-like declarer of war, Bologna moved to the next task on her list. Organizing a monthly dinner for embassy staff? Why couldn't the major domo do that? Bologna had trouble imagining Lavinia planning a dinner for servants. Maybe she had invented this to keep Bologna busy. Annoyed, Bologna pushed the list away. She had just been sitting still too long, she decided. As her own boss, she could decide on her own breaks. She flounced out of her office, although she couldn't help a little twinge of transgression as she waved to the guard at the door on the way out. Guard schedules. That was another thing on her list. Would she need to upgrade the security at the embassy in light of the recent unrest? Bologna was still thinking through that problem when she passed the park and saw Adechike sitting under a tree. "Adechike!" she called. He looked up dully. "Aren't we at war?" Bologna was taken aback and covered it with a laugh. "Adechike, in this time of madness, it is part of our responsibility as diplomats to maintain rational and cordial relations." At least she hoped so. She hadn't mentioned her previous meeting with Adechike to Lavinia. She could tell her when it bore useful fruit. "You are the one who declared war on us," Adechike complained. Bologna laughed again. "Surely you don't think that was my decision, Adechike.
You know how this works as well as anyone. Our government tells us what to do and we do it. But we can create change by working in the margins of what they don't tell us. Like this. It had started as babble to bridge the awkward situation until Adechike got over the declaration of war problem. But Bologna was warming to her idea. We should be interacting more, not less. That could be how we find the solution we need. The solution for how to be truly recognized for her abilities and dedication, at least. Adechike, meanwhile, was still reacting to the first thing she'd said. It's true, isn't it? Ojo was just doing what they told him to do. He shook his head. Still, though, he didn't have to defend them. And Adechike stopped suddenly. Bologna waited, but he wasn't going to go on. Still, he had been about to say something sensitive, something potentially important. She was sure of it. You need something to take your mind off all these problems, she said. We all do. Bologna clapped her hands. I've got the perfect idea. We'll throw a dinner for you. A dinner? A dinner party. After all, if the servants got dinners, why shouldn't the warders? I'll host it at the embassy. It will be a way to bring together the warders, only the young, fun ones, I think, in an informal way, to build bonds of affection that can cut across the strife of war. Chapter 7. Cassia. Penelope, seen through the scrying glass in the Vanian embassy, was stretched on a gravidity couch specifically designed to encourage circulation to the fetus. Penelope could make anything look regal, but Cassia had worked with her for years, and she could tell when her boss was miserably uncomfortable. So, Martika is throwing their might behind Rumika, she mused. We knew they would, Cassia reminded her. Yes, but the timing is interesting. And this stunt with the island, Penelope sighed. The matriarchs meet tonight. I will do what I can to influence them. Cassia did not ask in which direction. I have been discussing this with the matriarchs, and we think it best that I remain in Vania to support any fighting that may arise. You're not returning after the birth? Cassia hadn't realized how much she was counting on Penelope coming back and taking over every aspect of this crisis, letting Cassia go back to her old life. To Anton, for example, whom she hadn't seen in weeks. Not for a while. Although I would expect to return to my post after the war. After the war. What a strangely optimistic phrase. You'll be fine, Cassia, Penelope was saying. You are ready. And I'm always here if you have questions. Thank you, Cassia whispered. It wasn't lack of faith in her own abilities that was upsetting her, although she felt that, too. But being a warder was terrifying, and when it wasn't that, boring and also hard work. Especially now with this war. Penelope opened her mouth, but hesitated before speaking, and Cassia knew before the words came out what the topic would be. How is Ojo? Not well, Cassia said bluntly. Maybe it would make Penelope come back sooner. In any case, her boss had never liked sugarcoating. He looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. I'm sure he's having difficulty with the bride chamber. Penelope said as if to herself. Perhaps it's not his decision. I would guess not, Cassia said. Keep an eye out, Penelope advised her and cut the connection. Still that ritual of hierarchy, Cassia thought, and then remembered that she was now the top Vanian on Twaa-Fei and likely to remain so. It was an unpleasant thought. Cassia couldn't understand how people like Bologna, say, or Michiko, or really everyone, wanted to be in charge, except maybe Takeshi. And Anton, of course. Remembering the last time she saw Anton gave Cassia a pang of guilt. She should go find him. Her written report on the Twaa-Fei unrest could wait. Cassia walked past the gardens Anton favored, his favorite restaurant, specializing in rabbit, since he always said he got enough fish while at sea, and even went down to the middle island to check at the Falling Leaf, but she didn't see him anywhere. Surely he hadn't set sail again without saying goodbye. She wanted to check the shipwrights' quarter, where he sometimes went to coordinate repairs, but there was only one lift going down to the lowest island, supposedly for residents and people on official business, and she didn't think looking for her Hiroki pirate sometime lover qualified. Chapter 8. Chris. A dinner? She's throwing him a dinner. Chris crashed through their dressing room, unintentionally overturning a box of decorative pins. They are at war. What is the point of this? It's supposed to be an apolitical event, Alex said with the blandness that indicated disbelief. And she did invite you, too. Oh, yes, she invited me to her misblasted dinner after completely humiliating me at the council meeting. How dare she? Chris worked himself up again. Murtika is supposed to be on our side in a war, and now she's thrown a dinner party for the enemy? Did Oswald invite Lauren for brunch? Did the Empress have the Golden Lord over for cocktails? You used to be friends with the Duchike, Alex pointed out. Yes, before he betrayed me and our country and started a war. There was a knock on the door, and Nick came in, glancing at the disarray without comment. Warder Ueda here to see you. Chris shrugged. Send him in. Takeshi strode in, gowned in August gray with cobalt accents, as different from his usual aspect as a molted cribber. You look amazing, Chris gasped. All this for that silly dinner party? Takeshi swept his gaze around the dressing room. Chris noted that it hesitated over Alex, who had been female the last time Takeshi had seen him, but only briefly. That reminded Chris that in their current aspect, most cultures preferred greater modesty, and they pulled their dressing gown into order. So, you're actually going to this thing? Chris asked to cover their distraction. Of course, Takeshi answered, leaning against a bureau. Aren't you? Chris made a face. It's some gambit by Bologna. She's trying to make a fool of me, or of a Duchike, or possibly both. Or maybe just gain an advantage by having everyone happy and chattering incautiously, as they had once with a Duchike. Then I suppose the approach would be to be cautious with your chatter and listen to everyone else's, Takeshi said mildly. And if she is plotting something, wouldn't you rather be there to see what happens, rather than hearing about it secondhand? And then needing to report back to the government on what happened when the Murtican embassy burns down? Yes, I suppose so. Chris began to dig through the mounds of cloth with renewed purpose. Besides, it may give us the opportunity to build other alliances. Takeshi paused. I stopped by so we could walk over together. I wanted to tell you about my conversation with the Zenatans. Chapter 9. Michiko. Are you sure this is necessary? The floor beneath Michiko's feet was uneven, like brick or small paving stones. She could trail the fingers of her left hand along a damp wall. Anton, who had insisted on blindfolding her before taking her to the location of the survivor of the Rumican fleet, was clasping her right hand to guide her, but from the way he was walking slightly in front of her, she suspected it was a narrow passageway. I can't take any chances with this information, Anton said, but there was a lilting note to his voice that made Michiko think it was just his flair for the dramatic. That or she was walking into a trap. She gritted her teeth. Are we almost there? He had also insisted on doing it tonight, at the same time as Bologna's bizarre dinner party for a Duchike. While Michiko did not exactly regret missing what would certainly be a boring and uncomfortable evening, she couldn't help chafing at the idea of things happening without her. On the other hand, this was happening too. And if Anton was telling the truth, it would be much more important. Almost. His guiding hand rose, and Michiko found the steps with her toe. Up 3, broad and shallow, then big step here, Anton told her, and she was on something that swayed. A boat, of course. Where are we going? Michiko asked, reaching for her blindfold. Just a moment, Anton said, his hand catching hers. She waited, berating herself for being a fool, listening to the creak of wood. All right, he said, and pulled the scarf off her eyes. Michiko looked around wildly, but the dark bulk of Twaa-Fei's lowest island loomed not far away. Flickers of candlelight here and there, giving no clue what part of the island she was looking at. Greater illumination glowed from around the edges of the upper islands. Sorry, Anton was saying with a grin, but I can't let anyone know the location of the Blue Fang. Michiko spun around to see where the small lighter was headed. That's your ship? The Blue Fang looked like a Baroque temple more than a boat. Strange bulkheads of scavenged airstone extending in unexpected outcroppings from the broad hull, which was striped with what looked to be whale ribs. Michiko counted 3 projections that looked like cannon mouths, and that shape on the back. Could that be a trebuchet?
Best in disguise,
Anton replied with pride. Up we go. The blade crafter in the back of the lighter had navigated them deftly to a rope ladder hanging from the side of the ship, and Anton followed Michiko up to the deck.
She's in the medical bay, such as it is. Poor sod.
The survivor, a young Rumican currently in female form, was sitting up, at least. There were bandages wrapped around her head and one eye, and she had an arm in a sling.
She's had a bit of medication,
Anton whispered to Michiko as they entered the tiny cabin, and Michiko noted the flush to the woman's face and her unfocused eyes.
This is Zan, he said more loudly. How are we feeling today?
A bit better, the woman managed.
Can you tell this person here about what happened?
Zan turned her dull gaze to Michiko. She needed no encouragement. We had just entered the Engwahin Rocks, and 3 Mertican ships came out from behind a crag. We didn't think it would be too much of a problem. We were 6, and with guards and extra blade crafters. But she shook her head, then buried her face in her hands. What did they do? Michiko asked, fingers cold. They focused their craft in some way I have never seen, Zan said. I don't know. I'm not a blade crafter, but the ships just splintered apart, all of them. I was just lucky. I happened to be caught on one of the larger fragments, a chunk of airstone. And even so, I would have perished if... She gestured at Anton. Are you sure they were Merticans? They were all flying Mertican colors, Zan answered. And the ships had the Empress' prow, at least the one closest to me did. I could see the carving of her hair, the stones in her eyes. Zan shuddered and closed her own eyes. Yes, short of speaking with them, I'm as sure as I can be.
Satisfied?
Anton asked her. Michiko nodded. Zan was weeping openly now and had turned her face away. What will happen to her? Michiko asked in an undertone.
She hasn't decided yet,
Anton murmured.
It's too dangerous for her to be wandering around Twaa-Fei. We can return her to Rumika when we ship out, or find her passage on another ship, but she needs to recover more first. Besides,
war was coming to Rumika. She'd be more valuable here, Michiko said.
Are you volunteering to guarantee her safety?
Anton asked, and Michiko realized this was what he'd been angling for the whole time. She hesitated, then remembered she was a warder. Showing uncertainty was a luxury she wasn't allowed. Nothing can be guaranteed, but I'll take her under Kakute protection. Anton snorted eloquently. Fine, Michiko said. My personal protection.
What are you going to do with her?
Michiko had a brief vision of crashing Bologna's party with Zan in tow, but that had some obvious drawbacks. I'll think of something.
Think of it quick,
Anton told her. Michiko stared back at him. Why? What's your interest in all this?
War between nations never works out well for the Heroki. If more of you would trust us enough to use us as mercenaries, it might be different. But instead, we tend to get caught in the crossfire, resources get short, blah, blah, blah. Oh, then, Anton shrugged. It's upsetting Kasia.
Chapter 10. Chris. No one could say Bologna didn't know how to throw a party, Chris thought sourly, taking in the twisted silk bunting along the ceiling of the Mertican embassy hall. True, the flickering light from the chandeliers did make them look a bit like a shadowy spiderweb, but the colors were festive. The table was overflowing with artfully designed leaves and bird feathers, and the aroma palette, engineered with meticulously plotted potpourri placement, was at the height of fashion. Still, they were bored. To their surprise, Takeshi had drifted off to speak with the Dechike, whom Chris was still avoiding, and Michiko was nowhere to be seen. Was she absent on principle, as Chris should be, or had Bologna not invited her? They knew she hadn't invited Ojo because she'd been talking loudly about that when Chris had come in. This is just for the younger diplomats, she'd said, fluttering at herself with her fluffy, plumed fan. Especially in the face of conflict, we have to be unified and hopeful. It was so disingenuous that it made Chris gag, but Adechike didn't seem to mind Ojo not being around. From their distant, hovering perspective, Chris could see that Adechike didn't look much healthier than Ojo had at the council meeting. He had definitely lost weight, and there were shadows under his eyes. But at least he was smiling. Chris glanced sidelong past Cassia to catch another glimpse of that smile. They couldn't imagine what Bologna was saying that could make Adechike look so pleased and relaxed. They remembered laughing with Adechike about Bologna's quirks, gently, because Adechike never really wanted to see the bad in anyone. Chris wondered whether Adechike held to that when it came to them. "How are you doing?" Takeshi asked, materializing at Chris's side. Chris grunted. "I see you've made amends with Adechike. You aren't angry with him anymore? Please don't think I'm any less loyal to you." Takeshi took a sip from the cinnamon-scented drink in his hand. "But I'm coming to realize that mending rifts and working together is the only way we'll get through this." Chris snorted. "You are a healer." Takeshi didn't laugh, and when Chris looked over, he was shaking his head. "I don't think it's true," he whispered. "It doesn't make any sense. It would mean..." A bell rang, and in the middle of the salon, Bologna clapped her hands. "Time for dinner," she trilled. The dining room adjoined the salon through a set of open double doors. Trying to avoid Adechike and Bologna, Chris was the last to step through, and when they had torn their gaze from the extravagant array of candelabras on the table, they saw that everyone else was busy examining tiny cards by each plate. "Please find your seats according to the arrangement," Bologna was saying. "Ah, here I am." She plumped herself down at the head of the oval table. "And let's see." She peered at the card for the place next to hers, then raised her head with a devastating smile as Adechike settled in on the other side of the empty place. "Chris, this is you." Chris felt the blood heat their face in a rush. They were too incensed to speak. In that moment of rustling silence, they heard a sudden clamor from the hall. "Warder Avidas!" A servant slid into the dining room, looking terrified. "Warder Avidas, come quickly!" "What is it?" Bologna rose, her face a study in fury and concern. "It's Warder Conte. He's been hurt." Bologna moved, but Adechike was there before her. "Where is he?" he demanded, and followed the servant out in a half-run. Chris passed Bologna and caught up to Adechike by the embassy entrance. "Is he badly hurt?" they asked. The servant didn't answer, and Adechike didn't glance at them. Chris didn't know if it was a snub or if he was simply unaware of their presence. It had started to rain since they'd entered the embassy, and the pavement outside was dark and slick, reflecting the glow of the whale oil street lamps. Chris turned up the collar of their coat, but they didn't have far to go. Trembling, the servant pointed to a crumpled heap just outside the pool of light from a street lamp a block away. With a cry, Adechike ran toward it, him. For as Chris got closer, they could see it was Ojo, curled on his side in a puddle of slowly spreading blood.
You're listening to Born to the Blade, Episode 9, by Malka Older, starring Xe Sands. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Born to the Blade is created by Michael R. Underwood and written by Michael R. Underwood, Marie Brennan, Cassandra Kaw, and Malka Older. It is executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.